Hey, good morning. Good morning. How are we doing? We okay? We okay? Big leadership from a really great person. I want to talk today about one of the greatest leaders to ever follow Jesus and be trained by Jesus. We're going to talk about a guy today named Simon. And a couple days ago, a week ago, we kicked off this series. We noted how history has a distortion filter around the first followers of Jesus. If you go and look at any art in any museum about the disciples who followed Jesus 2,000 years ago, you may think that they were superheroes, extraordinary types of people. And yet what we learned last week is they're actually very common people, ordinary people. And that's good news for us because they were just like us. We can find ourselves following the same exact leader that they followed, and therefore we can learn a lot from their lives. That's the aim of this series, is just to look and see how we can learn from those who followed Jesus on this journey that we're on. And it doesn't take long in the story of Jesus to realize that there's one of his followers that is incredibly more prominent than the others. Matthew chapter 10, verse 2 puts it the most succinctly. Here's what Matthew says. He says, "These are the names of the 12 apostles." If you need a list, every one of the Gospels has a list. And every one of the Gospels starts this way. First, Simon, who is called, say it with me, Peter, and his brother Andrew. Andrew is who we looked at last week, but I want to show you this. First, Simon, who is called Peter. The word first there, it's the word chief. Come on, somebody. And though they weren't first this year, we'll get them next year. Is it still too soon for that? It feels too soon for that. I don't know. It still hurts. It still hurts. It means like the foremost, the preeminent, the one who is the leader. He is in every list in the New Testament, the first disciple mentioned, because everyone knew him to be the leader. Jesus entrusted him with leadership. In fact, from day one, Jesus saw the potential that was hiding beneath Simon's brash personality. Look with me, John chapter 1, verse 42. Jesus looked at him, Simon, and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. Now, which one translated Peter? It means rock, like Dwayne the Rock. We should call him Peter Johnson, is what we should call Dwayne the Rock Johnson. Peter means the rock. Years ago, I was growing up watching a lot of TV, and there were these commercials that you couldn't skip through, you couldn't bypass, and Chevy pulled on this Bob Seger song. Do you remember this? That was like the whole entire marketing department just liked Bob Seger, apparently, for Chevy, and they had this whole thing. And the whole idea was they'll sell you a pickup truck, we'll tell you it's like a rock, because when the blizzard comes, you want a car that's going to start up. So our Chevy is what you need to drive. It's like a rock, right? It's dependable, it's strong, it's going to be there for you. The funny thing about Jesus calling Simon rock, or Cephas, or Peter, is that Simon's nature was anything but a rock. He was brash, an unstable hothead. Simon was the kind of person who says yes before he's even counted the cost. If you got friends like this, they're the first ones to say yes, and they're the first ones to bail out. That's Simon. He's 100 miles an hour, just whatever he wanted to do in that moment. On the Enneagram, Simon was an 8. He was a challenger who loved picking a fight. And upon meeting Simon, Jesus gives him a new name. Why? Well, because Jesus saw something about Simon for him to become. See, Peter, when he named Peter, it was an aspirational name for him to live up to. A few years ago, I had the privilege of meeting and becoming an unlikely friend of this guy who was a pastor in Georgia. He was much older than me. His name was Michael. His list of ministry accomplishments were very, very long, very impressive. He did things that churches don't typically do to help people meet Jesus. And he had this larger-than-life public personality. But when I got to know him, I realized he was a very simple, down-to-earth, kind of quiet guy. Really enjoyed his grandkids, really liked watching Georgia football. That was like his life. Very simple, very ordinary. And one day on the phone, I asked him, I was like, "Michael, how did you accomplish so much? Like, I kind of was like, how did you accomplish so much? But I asked it a little nicer than that. I was like, how did you accomplish so much? And he told me about this core memory he had in life where one day he met someone that he really admired, an extraordinary leader in his own right. And at the end of their conversation, that person said to him, they said, Michael, I'm going to call you Maverick because that's who you are. And for decades, that motivated my naturally timid friend to rise to the risk-taking level of a maverick, and he aspired to become what he was called. Last year, Michael lost a long battle with cancer, but that conversation has made its way into my own heart from him, just remembering what that did when he realized my friend sees me not as a timid person, but as a maverick, what that can do. Receiving a nickname can be really powerful. When Jesus dubbed Simon Peter, he was declaring the good that he saw in him, that you're a rock of truth, that you're a rock of conviction. Except the problem with this name Peter is that the gospel writers themselves can't really decide whether or not they want to bestow upon Peter the same name that Jesus bestowed upon him. All throughout the New Testament, you see Peter, you see the name Simon still used, and then sometimes you see the name Simon Peter. It is one of the most confusing things in the entire scripture. Simon Peter, and sometimes within the same exact story, the gospel writers themselves mix up these names. In the Gospels, it's mixed up, but after Jesus rises from the dead, in the book of Acts, he is never, ever referred to again as Simon. He is fully Peter. And I want to tell you that something happened in his journey with Jesus where the transformation from Simon to Peter became complete. And that's just the big idea today. Sometimes it takes a long journey with Jesus to become what God calls us that we are. I'll say that again. Sometimes in your life, it will take a long journey with Jesus to become what Jesus looks at you and says that you are. Simon Peter was called by Jesus to follow him and be changed by him, but it took him time to grow into the faithful rock of truth that he became in Jesus. And I think that's really good news for you and for me today, for all of us who are on a journey of faith, because all of us are becoming what Jesus says that we are. You're full of faith, Jesus might be saying to you. But isn't it true? You might look at him and say, but I have so many doubts. You're strong and courageous, Jesus might be saying to you. But you might say back to him, I'm nervous and afraid. You're light for other people. And you might say to yourself, well, I live in such darkness myself. How can that be? But Jesus is in the business of changing us slowly to become who he sees us to be. That's true of me, that's true of you. There's no better example of that than the story of Simon becoming Peter in this scriptures that we see. Today, I'm just going to scratch the surface. I'm going to fly over Peter's life, give you a couple of high points. But I hope that you see the power of Jesus when ordinary people meet him today. To make that clear, I want to just walk through Simon's ordinary life, his ordinary desires, and his ordinary disappointments. That's just going to be my roadmap today. He had an ordinary life, and ordinary desires, and ordinary disappointments. First off, Simon was a fisherman. That's not an ordinary occupation here in Kansas. I'm still always amazed when I go to a restaurant in Kansas that fish is even on the menu. I don't trust it. I don't like it. I wish it was a thing that nobody here did because that is gross. A couple of months ago, Kristen and I, for our anniversary, went to the coast. We went to New England. We drove all the way up to Bar Harbor in Maine. And that was appropriate for us to pull off the side of the road and go to a restaurant and see fish coming off of a ship or a boat or I don't know what they call them, a schooner. I don't know what these are called. I'm from the Midwest. We don't have these things. That was great. It was normal. It was like lots of people in the coast have fishing jobs. If Jesus would have come to Kansas, he probably would have called cattle ranchers. But he lived in the Fertile Crescent. He lived in Israel, and fishing was a very, very common, one of the most ordinary occupations that people could have. And Simon was really good at this. He was a really good business owner. He was a really good fisherman. Luke chapter 5 shows us. If you've got a phone, you can kind of flip there. I'm going to bounce everywhere today, but I'll spend a little bit of time in Luke chapter 5. You can look for it yourself. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, just a quick note about the lake of Gennesaret. It's also called the Sea of Galilee. So just so you don't get confused. We're talking backstage. Someone gave me a nerdy Bible trivia. They're like asking me about the Sea of Galilee, and I one-upped them because I learned something about the Sea of Galilee this week. It was called Lake Gennesareth or Sea of Galilee, but the Roman emperor Tiberius didn't like that it wasn't named after something for Rome. And so he changed the name of this lake. This is a true story, y'all. I kid you not. He called it Lake Tiberius. It never caught on. And you may call it the Gulf of this or the Gulf of that, but we call it, I'm sorry, was that too far? I mean, some things just never change. I just want you to know, some things just never change. Jesus was standing by the Lake of Gennesaret. The people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. What a great picture. Jesus saw at the water's edge, two boats, and they're left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. So get the picture. Jesus is holding court. Meanwhile, these fishermen are actually doing their job. They're working hard. They're prepping. They're getting everything going. They just come in. They're washing their nets because they had just used them. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to who? Yep, Simon. And asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. You get the picture that people were just pressing into Jesus, and so he had to continually adapt and expand his capacity for people to hear him. So he sat down and taught people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." This tells you everything you need to know about Simon right here. He said, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." You kind of get like a fisherman looking at his buddies going, "This guy." You know what I mean? Like, we've just been out all night. This the time that you catch fish. Now it's day. We're tired. And while you were out there yapping away, preacher, we were cleaning our nets. Now the whole outfit's ready to go for the next shift starting in a couple hours. But this guy wants to let down the nets. You know what? No, I'm a nice guy. Here you go. We'll let down the nets. Here, you happy? That's kind of how I interpret Simon's response. And Simon was about to learn the value of doing what Jesus says to do. Verse 6, when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. What a chaotic scene. They came and they filled up the boats so that they began to sink. Sinking in Simon's life would be sort of a thing that happens often. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." What an incredible declaration about himself. When he recognized that he was standing in the presence of someone with greater insight, wisdom, and knowledge than he. Simon had already known from his brother Andrew that Andrew believed this was the Messiah, God's chosen one, who was coming to right all that was wrong in the world. When he saw that he had wisdom and a capacity to rule over this world with greater understanding than Simon himself had, he was struck in his core by how deficient he himself was. "Go away from me," he says to Jesus, "for I'm a sinner." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. So were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. They were the ones in the other boat that were called over to help with the catch. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." And so they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and they followed him. And I think that response from Simon is so normal, so ordinary for us. I remember when I met Jesus, I don't know if you've had this experience, if you've met Jesus, and maybe this is one of the things that's kept you from following Jesus in your own life, is because when you get close to Jesus, you recognize how not wise and not powerful and not together your own life is. I remember thinking, not me, I'm not in the same category to be near Jesus. I've got issues. But Jesus didn't think Simon had issues. Jesus said, "Don't worry, I've got something for you to do that you'll instinctively know how to do. I'm going to take your ordinary day job and give you a greater purpose. You'll spend time helping people find me." We'll call it fishing for people, if that helps you. That has never helped me, by the way. I hate fishing. And I think that there's a principle here that we learned from Simon, is that Jesus is able to take our day jobs and look beyond what we do. We kind of still do this thing. I think this is a thing that we've done for a very long time. we used to name ourselves after our occupations, right? So a family who was in town who baked bread, they were called the bakers. And the family in town that were like the craftsmen, they were called the smiths. And the family in town, we used to, our identity was what we do. And even today, you meet a dad sitting next to your kids, at a kid's basketball game, and you meet someone and you're talking to them, and you ask, hey, which kid's yours? And then inevitably, what do you do? Who are you, is the question. More often than not, we answer that question with our day job. COVID put us all in this existential crisis where we wanted to know, does our day job define us, and do I have to do my day job in a building? That was its own thing. But for the most part, our identity is derived by our regular occupations. I am a pastor. That's what I do. But, and honestly, a lot of you teach your kids to call Pastor Dan, like he's a man of God. Like, actually, no one here calls us that. That's fine. But there's this, you get my point. There's this intrinsic, and Jesus cuts right past all that for Simon. He says, I'm not calling you because of your job. I'm not calling you even in spite of your job. I'm going to use your job as you follow me to really make a difference in this world. And I love that Jesus is able to take our occupations and look beyond what we do and who we say we are, because what he is able to do with us. Jesus sees a potential for us to make a difference for him. So what does it teach us? I think it teaches us real simply, don't despise your 9 to 5. Jesus doesn't need us to be Elon Musk to change the world. I think he doesn't want us to. He just needs you to do you while obeying him. And so Jesus calls Simon to follow him. It sets him on a journey that results in Simon's desires starting to change. A few chapters later, there's this moment where Jesus again sends the disciples in a boat to the other side of a lake while Jesus remains behind and he prays. And it's in the middle of the night and the disciples are not making ground. There's a storm that comes up and they're pushing forward, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, they see somebody walking on the water towards the boat. And he calls out to them, and they recognize it's the Lord. And there's this moment, you maybe know this story because it's a pretty well-known story. If you don't, I'll just summarize it for you, that Peter looks out, and he's the one crazy person in the entire boat that says, well, if he's doing this, I want to do this too. And we see that in this story, Simon has an ordinary desire. His desire is to be like Jesus and do what Jesus has done or is doing. He wants to tap into whatever it is that Jesus, his teacher, has for him, to do the things that Jesus does. And I think all of us have in our core this desire, God, we want to be like Jesus. I want to do the things that Jesus does. I want to be, I'm not going to ask you to show your hands because everyone would have their hand raised, but don't you want to be as compassionate and loving and understanding and gracious as Jesus? I want that in my life, but you know what? I don't know how to get it sometimes. And Peter betrayed this sort of like internal desire, this ordinary desire, when he says, Lord, if it's you, call me out onto the water. Let me come to you. And Jesus, look at this, Matthew 14, verse 29. Jesus responds, he says, come. And then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. This shows us the heart that Peter had, this impulsive, adventurous, deep believer in Jesus. That Jesus can help him become what Jesus is, that Jesus can help him do what Jesus does. And if you know the story, you know that after a couple of steps succeeding, his circumstances start to overwhelm him. And Peter, never having walked on water before, realizes, I've never done this before. And he looks around and sees the wind and the waves, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. And in the midst of that moment, like a kid in a pool asking for their dad to catch them, Peter screams up to Jesus, Lord, save me. And Jesus catches his hand. What a sweet and simple reflex prayer. Before, we saw Peter pray, Lord, get away from me, for I'm a sinful person. And a little bit further down the road in his journey with Jesus, we see Peter crying out a different prayer. He says, Lord, save me. Help me. And in this moment, I think something switches for Simon. He realizes that Jesus can be trusted. He becomes more and more convinced of the power of Jesus. But Peter's growth in his life hits its greatest challenge the week that Jesus turns the corner in his own life to the purpose for which he came to live. It was the week that Jesus went to the cross to die. If you can fast forward with me in the story to the night Jesus held the Last Supper. It's a Thursday night. It's late. Jesus is describing to his followers the severity of what's about to take place. And though he has walked with Simon for some years now, a couple of years, he looks at Simon and he tells him this really ominous warning. He says specifically to him, he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. When you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Simon replies, and he fights with Jesus, and he's one of the only people in the entire New Testament to rebuke Jesus. He says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. I love that Simon fights with Jesus. He thinks he knows in his own power what he is capable of, what he's prepared to do, in his own impulsivity. I'll never leave you, he says. But Peter was completely unaware of the spiritual war that was being waged for his soul. Jesus says, Satan, the great enemy, the accuser of humanity, he is asked to try you. But I've had your back, Simon. I've interceded for you because I know your faith will fail. Despite all of his best intentions, Simon's desire to be like Jesus and to be with Jesus is met in a time of testing where he experiences, I think, the greatest ordinary or the most ordinary disappointment of life. That in the midst of Jesus' own trial, when things aren't going the way that Simon thinks they should go for Jesus, he can't see the future. The future doesn't turn out the way Simon thinks it should. That Thursday into Friday found Simon failing time and time and time again to be faithful to Jesus. I honestly feel bad for the guy because his greatest failures are recorded in the annals of history for us, just like Patrick Mahomes failing in the last Super Bowl is in the history forever. And we're going to choose to dwell on the 3 wins and not the 2 losses, right? Because it's still being written. But this is an important part of Peter's story. These some 6 hours of his life where his greatest disappointments ever become real hopeful for us. So I want to dig into it. Jesus takes his disciples away. He brings them to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is there to pray. He even looks at his disciples, and he says, the hour has come. Watch and pray so that you don't fall into temptation. And Jesus goes off by himself, and he comes back from being alone. He comes back to be reunited with his friends. And even in one of the gospel accounts, he looks at Simon and says, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not stay awake in my hour of need? And Jesus looked right at him and called out his failure. Then a crowd shows up to arrest Jesus. And when they get close and they press charges and try to arrest him, it's Simon who pulls out a sword. There were, we think, about 120 guards that had come into this small little garden area with torches and swords and with the Roman there was a lot going on here. And Simon, you need to think about this, 12 plus Jesus against 120. That's like everyone's taken down 10 dudes, and that's a lot. He pulls out his sword. He strikes this guy named Malchus in the ear. And this is embarrassing because he was clearly trying to go for the throat. And Jesus looks at him, and he has this moment where he says, Simon, really, put away your sword. And then he does the thing that no one is supposed to do when the odds are against you in a war. He takes the guy's ear, puts his hand upon it, and heals the guy. Simon is having a hard time understanding why Jesus would submit to a future that he can't figure out. But worst of all was Simon's greatest failure. when he did what Jesus said he would do, deny him 3 times that night. Jesus was bound by the guards, taken to the courtyard of the Romans, and they beat him and they flogged him. And Peter, along with John, 2 of the closest followers of Jesus, were some of the only disciples that followed him to the courtyard to watch all of this happen. And great fear seized Peter, especially when someone spotted him as one of Jesus' followers. They kept asking him, we recognize you. Weren't you one of his followers? We feel like we know you. We've seen you around with this guy Jesus. And 3 times Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And that 3rd time, just as he was speaking, Luke tells us the rooster crowed. And look at this. This is so haunting. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. It's in this moment where Jesus is helpless. He's bound. He's being beaten. Peter feels helpless. His future, it feels like, is being ripped away from him. He's scared for his own life lest he become like Jesus. Now no longer is it exciting to be like Jesus or do what Jesus does. And he denies Jesus the same way Jesus said he would deny him, down to the idea that the rooster crowed at the exact moment that he made his final denial. And Jesus looked at him. This is not the type of a look of a guy who just won a parlay bet. This is a look of severity. This is a look of disappointment. And Peter does the thing that you and I each do in our ordinary disappointments of our own lives, when we failed not just God, but ourselves. He ran away and wept bitterly. Here is a entrepreneurial fisherman who has conquered the waves, who has conquered this life, who has followed this Jesus down this road towards almost immortality. And here he is at the end of himself, weeping bitterly. His inability to reconcile pain and suffering with God's plan for Jesus. He had this inability to understand what God was doing in the midst of this trial. Though Jesus called him out of the waves, he sank. Though Jesus told him to be strong, he slept. And though Jesus told him he would deny, he did. And so Peter went out and wept bitterly because he was disappointed, not in Jesus, but in who he couldn't stop himself from being. He wanted to be Peter, but he couldn't stop getting in his own way. And isn't that like the most ordinary human problem that you and I all have? We want to become the thing that we know God is calling us to be, but we can't sometimes stop from getting in our own way. I know this is my story, this is my life. As I follow Jesus, I become more and more aware of all the things that are not like Jesus. It's one of the great paradoxes of knowing the Bible is the more you know the Bible, the more you realize you don't know about the Bible. The more you know God, the deeper you get into God, the more you realize you are not like God. You're not like Jesus. I think we all come to Jesus desperate and excited to have him change our lives, but not knowing the full ramifications of how far he's going to bring us to the end of ourselves. And it took Simon that Friday morning weeping over his own inability to live up to what Jesus had called him for him to see why Jesus came to save him. Jesus is in the business of helping us become what he calls us to be. Simon denied Jesus because he didn't know what was coming, that Jesus would die. Simon would put that body of his in a grave. And I think if you could tell Simon on Friday what Peter would find out on Sunday, it would have changed all of it for him right then and right there. But Jesus lets Simon go through Friday. I want you to hear that. Because some of us are stuck in the pain and disappointment that we've lived in our own lives. And we often wonder, like, God, why have you forsaken me? And the reality is that Jesus hasn't forsaken you. This is part of his process of maturing you. This is part of his process of growing you, is that he lets his followers go through Friday. I'm so glad Because when you go through Friday, the joy of Sunday is pretty stinking awesome. Because Sunday comes, everything, including Simon, is different. Because Jesus has risen from the dead. And here at Heartland, whenever someone says Jesus has risen from the dead, we say, Amen. I say it all the time that Jesus' resurrection changes everything, but it literally changed Simon Peter's faith forever. And I just want to unwind all of his life for you to see what's the change after the resurrection of Jesus. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize John chapter 21, but it's a great chapter for you to spend time in this week. John chapter 21. In John 21, everything that was ordinary about Simon gets flipped on his head. His occupation, his desires, and his disappointments. They all get flipped on their head. Beginning with first his restoration to relationship with Jesus. He has denied Jesus, but Jesus comes and he restores him back to this extraordinary restoration. Let me set the scene. As Jesus is risen from the dead, he showed up to his disciples, then he departed from them. For about a week, he was gone. Simon Peter has this great idea. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going fishing. And all the disciples, they go, okay, we'll go with you. Let's go. And so they're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Tiberias, whatever you want to call it. And Jesus happens to be out there on the shore. And he looks out upon them and he calls out to them instructions for how to do their job. Hey, how's the fishing going? Great. No? Have you tried the other side of your boat? Simon Peter has this like, oh my gosh, I hate people telling me how to do my job. Flips it, and there's a huge catch. So much so that the boats start to sink. And Peter realizes exactly what is going on. He's been here before. He knows what's happening. And in the story, Peter grabs his coat. He kind of wraps it around himself, and he dives into the water. He races back to the shoreline. John was one of the disciples in the boat that day when Peter bailed, and he's the one that writes this account. And he adds this little detail, which I kind of love. He says, and the other disciples had to struggle to get the boat into shore. It's kind of like this guy, in his excitement, just left us high and dry. But it's this incredible moment where his desires are satisfied. He sees Jesus, and he races to go see him. They're sitting along the seashore, and Jesus has been eating fish and bread. Some people believe there were 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread there, a callback to the moment when Jesus fed the 5,000s, but really nobody knows. But in this moment, Jesus looks at Simon and he asks him a question. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, heard that before. Do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. 2 more times Jesus did this, a total of 3 times. Why? Well, he was restoring his prized disciple. This was the last time in the story of the Bible that Peter was ever called Simon. He experienced for himself the extraordinary forgiveness of Jesus. I'm sure these 3 affirmations of his love for Jesus were not lost on Peter, as each one struck deep to the heart to heal the hurt places from his own denials. As Peter would reflect upon this moment later in his life, the moment when Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Peter could hear his heart echoing the moments where he had betrayed Jesus and denied him. I don't know him. And yet Jesus was giving him this great opportunity for forgiveness, to say, no, I do love you. I do believe in you. Later in his life, he would write about this in a letter that he'd write. Peter would become a leader in the church, and he'd write this statement, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Seems like brash Simon has learned a little bit about having a heart. He had experienced what the love of Jesus had covered for him. A sinful man full of disappointment and denial. But God's love offered Peter this new start, this opportunity to, last thing, turn his ordinary occupation around into an extraordinary calling. Jesus says, feed my sheep. Peter would become a shepherd of God's people who saw himself as a fisherman of souls. All these experiences on his life journey with Jesus softened him. They gave him sympathy and compassion for human weakness. No longer did he trust solely in his own power, but he had learned with Jesus that it's really better to just do what he says and to follow him wherever he goes, even if it takes you to places that are uncomfortable, because his way is best. Whether he calls you out onto water or he calls you to go through a Friday, following this Savior can protect you from the spiritual war that is going on that you're not even sure you know exists. And it can lead you into a calling that your life has always craved for. That same letter, Peter would write this to his sheep, if he's the shepherd, to his followers. He says this, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. But resist him, standing firm in the faith." He had become what Jesus said he would be. He finally saw his calling was to help others see Jesus and to protect them from the enemy. And this is a journey, a crazy journey for old Simon. And what a journey that is an invitation for you and for me too. We might not find ourselves walking on water, but we're just as commissioned and called by Jesus to be changed by him. And if it hasn't happened for you all in one step, well, that's okay. Because Jesus often leads us one day at a time, one season at a time, one trial at a time, to help us become the beloved friends of his that we are. Love for us to respond as we close out our service today just with a song, as we sing to what God is calling in us and the risk that he's willing to lead us through. Would you guys stand? Jesus looked at Simon and said, "Do you love me?" Gosh, there were so many questions in his life, but that's the one that matters the most. Do you love Jesus? Because if you do, you're in for one heck of a ride in this life. Through the ups and the downs, through the waves that come your way, you have a hope that is secure. Hey, you don't want to miss next Sunday. We're going to honor Craig, but also the inestimable, unmatchable, wonderful Kristen Jacobsen will be in the house to bring a message next week for all of her fan club that is here. I just love that. I love that. She's here next week. We love you. You're loved. We'll see you next week.